Hello, lovely people. This episode is with Margaret Killjoy. Margaret is someone who I've been reading, following, listening to, all of that fun stuff for quite some time now because she has a way of viewing the world and understanding complex problems that I find appealing / inspiring / inspiring is enough. Margaret has two podcasts, Live Like the World is Dying and Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff. I recommend both of them. I am a regular listener to both of them. And obviously Live Like the World is Dying is the kind of the title that we stole for this episode title as well, because I'm very creative. But it's actually very important because this was the core theme, if you want, of this episode. But as you know, dear listeners, new and old, may know by now, the fire these times, at least one of the things we try to get into is this question of hope in the time of the climate apocalypse. And hope not just as a, I'm gonna say, wishy-washy kind of feeling, although I'm not very fan of that representation either, but rather as, you know, Margaret herself quoting, I believe it's Mariam Kaba, if I remember correctly, said this, like, hope is a discipline. So what does that mean? Like, why? Why is it a discipline? Like, why is it even something to bother with, really, given that the state of the world is such that it's kind of pointing at, in every possible direction, whether it's because Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza is being effectively supported by a lot of Western powers, whether it's because the economic system that we are all forced to live under is quite literally destroying life on this planet, whether human life or more than human life, as we call the non-human world, and, you know, other stuff that I'm not going to get into too much because this introduction is long enough as of now. I'll quickly say a couple of things, if that's okay. One, very personal. You may or may not notice that I'm going by a different name now. This isn't for any kind of, let's say, identity reasons. It's more that I'm trying as much as I can to separate my public persona from my private persona. And this is something that was especially prompted by me becoming a father in the very, very recent past. And so, yeah, the name I'm going for publicly is Elia. Very simple. If folks actually want to know why I've picked that name, it's going to be on the website, my personal website, at some point in the future, if that's of any interest. It doesn't really matter for now. The second thing is that there's this other podcast called Politically Depressed, and it's part of the family, let's say, of the Fire These Times, same family. Both of us, as well as Obscuristan and an upcoming podcast called Hida, spelled Hidah, which is not out yet. But the four of us, and soon more than four, are part of this collective that, as of yet, doesn't have a website, but it's called From the Periphery. And, you know, there will be time to talk about this more in the future. But I wanted to bring up Politically Depressed for a couple of reasons. One, it's resonating with a lot of people, and I think there's a good reason for that. Ayman Makarim, who's the host of that podcast and a co-host of the Fire These Times, you may have heard him here. He's, you know, been on a bunch of different episodes. He was actually a guest of the Fire These Times when I started it, and I was doing kind of my own thing back in 2020, I believe, speaking about the concept of building mutual aid in Lebanon. But the concept of politically depressed, as in political depression, is a very interesting one and something that I've personally been wrestling with for quite some time now. And that's why I'm very grateful that Ayman kind of found the words for it in many ways. So check it out. It's very like personal. He talks about personal anecdotes as kind of this queer Lebanese living in Vienna. So questions surrounding immigration, questions surrounding the region we come from. There's a lot of talks about Gaza and the ongoing genocide by the Israeli state. And, you know, other stuff. They're not easy to listen to necessarily, but I do think that the way, at the very least, Ayman approaches them is pretty cathartic. And political depression is, of course, kind of the undercurrent of this conversation that Aydın and I had with Margaret Killjoy. Because the question of how to live like the world is dying is very important. It's not saying, Margaret is going to explain all of this more in detail, of course, but I just wanted to make very clear up front. It's not saying that the world is ending. It's not saying that everything is hopeless or there's no point or whatever. This is very much not a nihilist podcast. I personally very much disagree with that worldview. But the world is not doing very well, and we need to find ways to live in ways that are both healthy for that world, for the more than human world, as we call it, and of course for humans. And that's not easy. And that requires sort of a framing, or at least among many. This is not prescriptive. We're not telling you how to necessarily, even though the title may be How to Live Like the World is Dying, but this isn't really a literal like how to, and if you don't do this, you are not a good person. Please don't take this too literally. This is just a podcast. It's more like the world isn't doing too well. At the same time, we don't want to die. I'm not a fan of it. I'm not a fan of death. I'm young. Ask me in 60 years. And I genuinely feel that I genuinely believe rather that there are good things about this world that are worth fighting for and making the world a better place as a result, whether we're talking about the human world or the more than human world. So this is what this conversation was about. I genuinely think you're going to enjoy it. Again, I'm very biased because I'm one of the hosts of this thing that you're listening to. And if I'm wrong, this is a challenge. If I'm wrong, listen to it anyway. Leave a 5-star review, an amazing comment on Spotify or whatever other podcast app you listen to. Tell everyone about it. Say like, this is amazing. And after doing all of that, send me an email telling me that you didn't like it. But you have to do all of these things first. This is a challenge, and yeah, I know this is supposed to be funny. Okay, guys, this was already a bit long. Sorry about that. Honestly, this is an amazing episode, and you should give like Margaret's work a read, a listen. I always found her inspiring, and I think you will all agree. And again, if you don't, that's okay. Just leave a 5-star review anyway. Okay, bye. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Friday Times. Today we'll be joined with Margaret Killjoy and Aydın. We're going to be talking about a topic that, Margaret, I know you've discussed at length, whether it's on your various podcasts, and please feel free to like plug everything, and in your writing and and so on, which is like essentially how to live like the world is dying. So this question of hope versus doom, is it even like two sides of the same coin? Are they different things? We can get philosophical, we can get very practical, whatever, we'll see. And I will start with, let's start with some very basic intros. Aydın, this is also your first time on the pod, even though you're part of this collective that you're going to talk about, if you don't mind, that is working with the Friday Times. And of course, Margaret, also you introduce yourself. So let's start with Aydın, just alphabetically, if that's okay.
Sure. Hi, folks. My name is Aydın. I use they, them pronouns. I work with the Antidote Zine project, which is a collaboration or works in collaboration with the Friday Times, as well as other grassroots movement media outlets. We publish transcriptions, translations, and transmissions that focus on stories that don't ordinarily get told, or stories that need to be uplifted more in movement spaces to our mind. We come from an anarchist and anti-authoritarian perspective, and we focus predominantly on struggles that are going on around the Mediterranean Circle and now in Minneapolis, because that's where we're based. And it's a pleasure to be here with you both.
Thanks, Aydın. And Margaret?
Yeah, I'm Margaret Killjoy. Use she or they pronouns. I am a US-based anarchist, and I do a lot of media work. I write a lot of fiction. I write some nonfiction. I do a lot of podcasting, and I work with a publishing collective called Strangers in Tangled Wilderness that puts out podcasts and books and zines and things like that. And I have a couple podcasts, but the one that's most relevant probably to what we're talking about is called Live Like the World is Dying. And I'm one of 3 hosts, but it's a show that I started right before the COVID pandemic as a way to try and reach out about this thing that I felt a little bit alienated from in the circles that I was in like anarchist circles, which is my interest in individual and community preparedness for disaster and crisis and apocalypse and whatever. And it also came out of an essay I wrote called Live Like the World is Ending. But then someone pointed out that I had a really easy pun, like right there, like live and die. And so I got really excited about that. But the essay is not like, hey, the world is ending. It is, hey, it might be. I don't know. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? What do we do about it?
Yeah. And yeah, we'll definitely get into that. It's a let's say a healthy/unhealthy obsession of mine for quite some time now. This concept of hope, apocalypse. I'm from Beirut, and we had like an image of that in 2020 with the explosion, and that felt very apocalyptic as well. And that's how it was described in many ways. So that topic's been on my mind for quite some time. So because this can go in like 1,000 different directions, I figured we'll start with like a pretty broad question actually that will just then narrow it or branch out or see where the wind blows, whatever. Which is like the kind of the how-to question, in the sense of not how to live like the world is dying, because I don't want to, it's not a prescriptive thing necessarily, but how have you been thinking about that since we have essays, we've read essays that, go a few years back at the very least, even before the pandemic, because the pandemic obviously in 2020 onwards made that topic feel very or more prescient maybe for many people than it did beforehand. So yeah, talk to us a bit through about like the trajectory, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I first started thinking about it. Well, I mean, on some levels I was thinking about it for a very long time. I remember there's this book Desert that came out, and it's this very short book, and it's presented as green nihilism. It comes out of, I believe, anarchist circles, and it basically presents this like, hey, we're not going to fix the climate disaster. What then? What does that mean for us in anti-authoritarian struggle, right? And it was very good. But one of the things that even when I read it back then, I was like, oh, this is naively optimistic. It thinks that we're like gonna survive. For a while, from my reading of climate news and climate science and stuff, and I'm not a climate scientist, but I was like, well, actually things might be bad enough that we might be living underground and growing food in greenhouses only, and relying heavily on hydroponics and things like that if the climate on the surface of the world becomes completely untenable. And I'm not saying that is what's going to happen. I'm absolutely not. But I'm saying it could. And so when I read Desert, I was like, this is like a good first start, but it's a little bit. And then everyone else was like freaking out because it was like so doom and gloom, right? And I was like, oh, it's kind of naively optimistic. And then the other thing that I started doing, the way it started interacting with my life, was I actually started really taking into consideration what it meant for the lack of future that I felt, which is really funny, right? Because I'm come from this like punk anarchist background or whatever, where like no future is like, tagged on all the squats and stuff, right? But then I like made it into my 30s, and I'm in my 40s now. And I'm like, well, I made it past the no future I thought I was going to have, right? And so why am I more no future now than I was before? And I actually think it's a sober look at society. And it doesn't mean I'm going to die. It doesn't mean any individual person is going to die. It means that I think that the way that things are happening is not going to continue to be the way that things happen. And I think we're already starting to see this breakdown. And of course, this breakdown looks very different in different places. In a lot of ways, it's like the West that is insulated from this level of disaster. And then especially in North America and in the United States and Canada, because Europe still has within family memory and sometimes living memory has World War II and the level of devastation of that. And the Cold War was, I think, even more present there than it was in the United States. But one of the ways that it influenced me is that I realized for a little while, I stopped writing books and I started focusing on music, because I was like, writing books is this long game cultural influence, right? It takes you a year to write a book. It takes a year to find a publisher. It takes a year for the book to come out. And then it takes 2 or 3 years for it to like percolate out into and start having an impact, right? And in a lot of ways, especially as a fiction writer, what I'm hoping to do is influence how people think about problems and how people think about themselves. And that change happens generationally, right? A song you listen to and it's like 5 minutes later and you like get what's happening, And so I was like, I don't have fucking time to write books. And then the world didn't end, right? We didn't fall immediately into a fascist thing. It's much slower and more annoying than that in the United States. And all my friends weren't like rounded up and killed or whatever. And I got back to writing books eventually. And as I started writing more about this, what I realized, what it means to me is not putting all of my eggs in one basket. And that includes the basket of apocalypse or I'm about to die, right? There's roughly 4 ways things could go, right? I think. Well, I'll find out how many fingers I'm holding up by the end of this.
We have it, I think. I didn't you put the 4 things at some point?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, it's in that essay, but I haven't read that essay in a long time. So now I'm just like riffing. Okay, so the status quo could continue. That is like absolutely a possibility. Capitalism has proven very sturdy. Marx was entirely wrong. Much like when Jesus was like, oh, the world's about to end, like in y'all's lifetime, back in the day, and it didn't happen. The same thing is true of all the people who said that capitalism was going to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions or whatever. It just didn't happen. And it may happen. I don't know, but I'm not counting on it, right? So that could happen. So then climate change, we could stop it, right? Or like stop the worst of it and all come together and, do a big, like a Green New Deal on a worldwide level, but more radical and create everything good or whatever, right? That's a possibility. And I'm not trying to rule that out. And I'd be very excited to be one of the assholes trying to push for that to be less hierarchical, And then there's the climate change is coming and we're going to die. That's a completely a possible thing. It's a possible thing, especially as like fascism comes to the United States. Being a really public anarchist isn't going to really do me a lot of favors, So I could just be about to die, right? Which is always true, but it's a little bit extra true right now. And then, of course, there's the climate change could come and it could make everything bad and we could survive it. And it could be sort of deserty or post-apocalypse or whatever, cool thing where we can run around in weird clothes and whatever.
Like Mad Max is a documentary.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm going to put on a nice outfit and hang out in a cage and lure men to their deaths the way I was born to do. And I don't want to tell people to do one of those things or the other, or like count on one of those things or the other. And I want people to, if you read like financial planning documents, they're like, don't put all your eggs in one basket and, diversify your assets or whatever, right? And I'm like, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to make sure I have done what I want with any of those outcomes. And since one of those outcomes is die, I just have to like make sure to like tell my friends I love them and, spend more time with my family and hang out with my dog. That's the big picture. That's what I'm about.
Love it.
Just before you came on, we were chatting, Aydın and I said that so you said like you stopped writing books for some time.
Mm-hmm. For
me, it was, I genuinely stopped, and it really feels like for the longest time, I'm going to say maybe like a decade, watching any kind of nature documentaries. I was completely unable.
I can't do it.
Yeah.
Continue. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I haven't met anyone else who said this before.
Not because like I would be genuinely very happy for the most part, just watching cool, like whales doing cool stuff and whatever. And I like whales and turtles, whatever. But then, especially like at the time I had the DVDs of the David Attenborough ones, and the last episode was always the this is like the way it's set up was like 9 episodes of how the world is amazing and beautiful and wild and all of that stuff, and the last episode is this is how we're fucking everything up, and this is how everything's being destroyed, and maybe we shouldn't do that is the conclusion. Like it's not how it's just like it seems bad to destroy the entire rainforest, like he would say. And I was like, I know, but so what do I do with this information right now? I'm in Lebanon. What what do I do with this? And so it got overwhelming at one point, and I just stopped generally, and books as well, like anything. I think also like to some extent, I mean, I still enjoy doing it, but definitely less so than I did before. Like even camping and like going in, I was so traumatized by just that overarching like reality, basically. And this is what, like 15 years ago, something like that. Progressively, I'm not going to say got over it, but progressively started like approaching it in a different way. I was one of those, which is, I guess, many people who was genuinely very inspired by like Greta Thunberg doing her thing, and we're both autistic. So there was also this link, and I was able to understand how, when she was saying that like she couldn't get rid of the thoughts, that this is just not enough, we're not doing enough, and so on. I sympathize with that, and I then also felt bad that I was also wasn't doing enough, but that's a different thing. So yeah, that was my kind of like I identified with that. I want you to talk, because you know me, When I send voice notes to my friends, it's like an entire podcast, and this is an actual podcast, so I need to shut up.
No, this is I haven't heard those thoughts externalized before.
Awesome.
And I feel them deeply. Like I mean, I remember, for a while I lived in a van, and a part of it was like, I need to see this stuff. It's going away, but every time I go see the stuff, I'd be very aware of the fact that it's going away.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to handle. It's so hard to really sit and think about what this all means. And, we get overwhelmed by these problems, and then we kind of shut down our processes. We stop being able to think about it's too much problem,
Yeah.
I think there's something that I really appreciate about the framework that you have in this essay, which I read in the fall of 2020, after living through, I live in the neighborhood where George Floyd was murdered. And after living through the uprisings here in Minneapolis, just kind of in the heart of it, I came across this essay, and I thought it was extremely helpful to be reminded to look at the kind of like longer term. Like, I had been feeling this act like we're about to die all summer long. And it was really helpful to remember that just as important is to look at the long term. And even if it feels like maybe slightly delusional, to think about like, what is the slow work? What is the long-term healing? What kind of new systems and social infrastructure are we building? And then just like the personal, really like life-giving force of like focusing on joy and wonder. And I found that piece particularly challenging. I mean, relevant to the conversation of like watching nature documentaries, or just like going camping, being like going and seeing the things that we're currently like thinking the prospect is that we will lose a lot of the beauty in the world, in the natural world, especially. Yeah, I think there's something to honoring the grief that we encounter in that experience, and it can feel like too much, or it can be super overwhelming, because it's like, wow, like how could I possibly love something that I'm like that is slipping through my fingers as I encounter it. And at the same time, that grief is the way that we and our bodies are honoring the beauty and the joy and the wonder that we're experiencing. And that's just like, it can be so hard emotionally to hold those contradictions. And yet I think that is some of the most important work we can do to like be able to carry on and be able to continue fighting for these things that are so precious and fragile, or feel precious and fragile.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious if you still referenced this framework of the act like we're about to die, act like we might not die right away, act like we might have a chance to stop this, and act like everything will be okay. I feel like it was very, dare I say, prophetic to write this in late 2019. And I was curious if any of these resonate with you more now, or if you feel like that framework has changed for you, or if you're still like really holding on to it and what it means to you now after the past 4 years.
I think I still hold on to it. Yeah, Live Like the World Is Dying, the podcast came out in January 2020, and our like third episode is this entirely incorrect assessment of COVID with a public health, an anarchist who works in public health in the UK. And it's just like, wash your hands, stay home if you get sick, And I don't know if we took that one down. I mean, it's so obviously incorrect now that, but I think I still hold by this. I think I have come to a little bit more, I wonder if this is true. I'll say this right now, and maybe it's not true tomorrow. I've come a little bit more to like a peace with whatever happens. And I still believe in like holding on to those 4 ideas, right? And not making assumptions. And the way I prepare as a, someone who's into preparedness is absolutely built on it. I think about whether paying down my mortgage, I'm lucky enough I moved somewhere incredibly cheap and, live rurally and pay a mortgage, right? Whether or not I want to pay that down, or whether I want to like buy a table saw. And I'm like, you know what? The table saw, or even like I don't put money towards retirement. If I made enough money, I probably would, but I'm kind of like, I put money towards retirement by like drying food and keeping it in my basement, and buying a table saw is my like weird example. Because I remember I didn't have enough money. It was like kind of a like, oh, do I need this table saw? Like, do I really? And I'm like, hyperinflation is happening. And I'm even like from an economic point of view, I'm like, well, actually this object that has value to me, not monetary value, doesn't resell for a lot. This object is more important for me to have, and it is cheaper now than it will be 6 months from now. And so I try to think very practically. When I think very practically, I use that framework. But in terms of personally, and even like how I'm back to writing books, I just sold a trilogy to a press called Feminist Press, and I will be talking more about it in the near future. I'm really excited about it. And, you know, only one of those books is written, right? And so I got to write these 2 other novels, and, you know, they're going to come out over the coming years. And I'm like, you know, and I have to have conversations with my press about which states are legal for me to do talks in, you know, and I'm kind of an asshole, so I'm just going to do it anyway. And also, like, there hasn't been like a big crackdown on like white trans ladies giving book talks, you know, but there could be. And like the laws are in place with which to do it. There's a lot of places where if I give a talk, it is technically a strip club because I am there, you know?
Right, yeah.
And so, but I'm still going to write these books because like, fuck it. And I read a lot of history, and I read history, and it's like poets living through wars and people surviving or not surviving genocides by continuing to do the things they do. You know, I read about, oh, I'm not going to remember his name, a photographer who was a surrealist who was Jewish and survived World War II hiding in the bathroom of a different surrealist and developed like new photographic techniques for photographing miniatures while in the bathroom for 2 years or whatever, you know? And like, and that man could have died any day, you know, absolutely. And so there's this old, I used to think it was like a punk quote, but I think actually punks got it from the Quran.
Oh, yeah.
Which is if the world were ending tomorrow, I would plant a tree today. And, you know, like when I came up in anarchy, that everyone had back patches that were like cute with like bicycles and trees and stuff, you know, because I came up during a very posy time of anarchy, which I sometimes am nostalgic for. Now we have guns and stockpiles of food, at least in the US. But, you know, and then eventually I'm like, oh, this is actually like, I think actually one thing that anarchists in particular, I would say like leftists and atheists and stuff are particularly bad at is forgetting that wisdom can be found in theological texts and ideas. And so it was like really meaningful, like in my own journey towards realizing that theology is interesting and useful, was realizing that this thing I had assumed was like a punk quote was from the Quran. And that's the attitude I'm trying to have. And it's actually literal where I live. I'm going to go plant an orchard. I think it is at least 50-50 that I will never eat fruit from the trees that I plant. And unlike if I were die to, you know, because a lot of the things that we do are like, oh, well, it'll be for the next generation. You know, I'm going to write this book, or I'm going to plant this tree, or I'm going to, you know, keep up the fight for the next generation. And I'm like, the next generation does exist, and I'm not trying to write them out of existence preemptively, but they're in trouble. And it is completely possible that I will plant an orchard, and if the trees survive the climate change and the shifting growing zones, you know, no human will ever eat their fruit. And so I just need to learn to enjoy the process of planning as if I have a future and planting this. I'm really just trying to hype myself up for planting this orchard. My growing season is kicking in real early because it is February and 60 degrees out. I can't do the Celsius conversion. It's a very nice, lovely temperature outside. 18. Yeah, something. I don't know. I made up 18. I'm not sure.
Listeners can Google it.
Yeah. So that's why I'm not going to go plant it. I am spreading the path to the orchard right now. That's what I came in from doing. It's shoveling mulch around onto cardboard.
Almost exactly a year ago, I was. I live in Switzerland, so obviously lots of mountains, and we were in one of the in a chalet or whatever for like a week. And I was reading Rebecca Solnit's book, Orwell's Roses. I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't.
It's really good. It's one of the few nonfiction books I've read twice, which is like not a thing I usually do.
Okay.
But it's like Orwell had, like George Orwell obviously, was really into gardening, which is a big thing he was into. And it's not something most people notice, but when you, after reading this book, Rebecca Solnit mentions, for those who don't know, Rebecca Solnit wrote a book called A Paradise Built in Hell, which was one of the early books for me that dispelled this notion of the kind of the dog eat dog world, which I really annoys me because dogs don't do that. But the dog eat dog world of like, it's just true. They just don't. I have dogs.
That's such a good point. Sorry. No, please continue.
No, it's like I grew up with dogs. We had 9 dogs at one point in Lebanon. I've always been with dogs all around. I've been at a dog shelter. My aunt has one in Lebanon as well and stuff. And it doesn't happen. Like if it gets really bad, dogs just get exhausted, and like humans do, really. They don't like develop whatever. It just bothers me.
Yeah.
But that book by Solnit was actually people come together in disaster situations. And Hurricane Katrina was kind of the big case study at the time in that book, and many other examples. And what she didn't have the term for it, but what I later learned, the image we usually have of what happens in disasters is actually more of like elite panic. It's the term for it, which is a book of that name. People can look it up if they want. It's really good. But Orwell's Roses was interesting because a lot of the metaphors that he uses were about gardening and roses and whatnot. And he generally took it very seriously. He took gardening as a political act. And I found that very interesting as like 30s and 40s, like it's, for me, it's like a not just a generation away. It's like, it's a completely world. Like it's just a world in the past that I cannot conceive of necessarily. And this book helped me kind of do that a bit because it was very concrete. The other thing is that regular listeners know by now, like we've had a daughter recently, like a kid was born a few months ago. And if all goes well for her, we use her and them, they might live to the year 2100. Like it's not, it's feasible. I mean, all things considered. And for me, that's like, it really puts things in perspective, because whenever I think about the late 1800s, it feels like it's so ancient. Like you may as well be talking to me about like the pyramids or whatever. But that's not that far away in terms of distance. I was born in the 90s, it's almost exactly that timeline. And obviously grandchildren later on would even be further down the line. But it really makes it very concrete for me as someone who I was worried that I realized a lot of my despair, and maybe we can segue to that question that we were kind of wondering. Despair is something that at one point I kind of felt was almost like a privilege I was indulging in. It's not quite the terms for it because it feels too harsh. And I do feel like, to be clear, I do feel like there's a space for it, and there are like times where you just, like in Arabic, there's this expression like fashit khilq, like just letting off steam kind of thing. Like at one point there is you kind of need, I need to really feel the despair in some sense in order to then get over it, or at least move on, or whatever it may be. It's because it is a form of mourning. It is a form of grief as well, I think. And then for me, then again, as I said, because also there's this kind of new timeline in my head, like it's no longer about I'm turning 33 this year or whatnot. It's also like there's actually this different timeline now, which is like, oh, my kid is 2 months old or 3 months old or 1 year. It's like a different thing in my head now. Yeah. Did I actually formulate the question? I don't know. But like the concept of despair is something that I sort of feel like it's inbuilt in a lot of the work that you do, of at least trying to struggling with that concept, struggling with that, because it's common, right? Like, and doomerism is pretty common these days, especially in like online cultures, whatever. But my circle of friends, it's very common for us to be there for one another as much as we can. But ultimately, a lot of the things we talk about is about like how bad things are, without necessarily knowing what to do about it in the moment, right? Like, or at least kind of like that documentary I mentioned, like 9 episodes of like good stuff, and then the last episode is really bad. And this is like the flip side. It's like 9 episodes, everything's bad. But hey, you have like, you can figure the things out later maybe, or you can have some hope, and just have some hope, and you get lost. I get lost. Yeah. And so concretely, what do you think about despair? Let me put it very, very basically.
Okay, I'm going to go into theology.
Go for it.
Okay, so there's this quote, I think it's Mariam Kaba, which is, hope is a discipline. And I love that quote. And then when I researched more about it, it's been a while since I did this research. I'm riffing here a little bit. She says that she learned it from a Catholic nun. This wasn't her quote. She's like, she popularized it, and that's good work. And I don't really love intellectual property and these kinds of ideas and stuff anyway. But the fact that it came from a Catholic nun is not a coincidence. There is a Catholic concept that despair is a sin. And sin in Catholic conception of it, it's like a bad thing, but it's not a real bad thing. It's like well, of course you did. You're a person. Of course you did a sin. That's what's involved with being a person. And you just try not to do it again, but you know that you will, And when you do, you go talk to someone. I'm not trying to be and therefore the Catholic Church is good when I say these things, but but when you do, you go and you talk to someone, you say, I did the thing again. And the guy's like, when it's always a guy, which is one of the problems of the Catholic Church, is like, well, don't do it again. You're like, but I'm gonna. You're like, yeah, but don't. But when you do, come back here again,
Yeah.
And despair, I mean, in this concept, despair means specifically ceasing to believe in heaven or whatever the fuck, right? But I think as a broader concept, this idea that despair is this thing that we fight against, and we do it by cultivating the discipline of hope. When I first came up into anarchism, talking shit on hope was the cool thing to do, because what we like to do as radicals is come up with a word that everyone knows what means and then redefine it to mean something slightly different and say that we're against it, and then get mad at everyone who says that they still believe in the thing, even though we've redefined it and we're talking about two different things. I don't love discourse, but you would talk shit on on hope, because hope was being defined as hope that someone else is going to sweep in and save you. You don't hope that you eat today, you go out and find the food. It's the example that people would use. And this is all wrong. I mean, whatever, words, we can just redefine them however we want. But I don't think this is a useful redefinition, because if I don't think that I have a chance of finding food when I go out, I might not. I might just sit around and starve, and give in to despair. If I hope that I will succeed when I do the thing, then maybe I'll do the thing. And I like that hope has a certain irrationality to it, right? Hope and or faith, depending on how we're talking about things, I'm not trying to go crazy religious in this, but I think it actually does tie in, is the opposite of anxiety. And anxiety is what's wrecking all of our nervous systems right now and making this precious little time we have on Earth less good, is that we're anxious all the time about all these things that can happen. And the more that we're just well, bad stuff's going to happen. Of course it is. That's what happens. We're alive, and one day we won't be. And the process of going from one to the other is going to hurt. That's a guaranteed. So fuck it. Don't worry about that now. And hope is slightly irrational in the way that anxiety is slightly irrational. And so it's good. It is good to cultivate hope during dire times, because it allows us to do more with what we have now. And that said, I do have a certain love for the nihilist attitude. And there's a book, Blessed is the Flame. I've only read part of it. It goes around that's talking about when you know you're going to die, you go out in a blaze of glory and go kill your Nazi captors or whatever, and that's great too. I'm not, but if I embraced a more nihilistic attitude, and by that I mean a non-hopeful attitude, I wouldn't go out in a blaze of glory. I would eat junk food and watch TV until I died or whatever, and
Same.
I don't know. I mean, depending on the situation, but so I allow hope to get me up in the morning. And okay, the other way I'm going to compare this, I have a lot of weird mixed metaphors in my head. I play a lot of strategy games.
Yeah.
And you're often losing when you're me and you play a lot of strategy games, or when you're an anarchist or an anti-capitalist who's anti-authoritarian or whatever the hell, right? And you're trying to end all of the bad things at once. We don't tend to win, right? Not long term. I still think we can, but I think we'll pull this off because hope is a discipline. But if I'm playing a game, I am playing to win, and I want to look soberly at the conditions of the game and figure out what my best strategy is to win, no matter where I'm at in the game. If I am in the process of winning, I can't just sit back and stop thinking about it and just roll with inertia. I have to keep thinking about what's involved, what's happening, and how do I win. When I'm losing, you have to do the same thing. And The only other thing is forfeiting, right? And that's no fun for anyone on either side of the chessboard. I don't know why it's suddenly a chessboard. I don't play chess. In my head, the game that I'm thinking of is this weird game that I played as a kid called Stratego. That was this like war chess game when I was a kid. Anyway, so you just have to look at what's happening and say, what are the win conditions and how do I move towards them? And that's how I feel about like stuff like climate change is like the big one, you know, is I'm like, well, at any given point, I want to look to say, what are the avenues by which we can win and move towards them? Because that is a better way to live. I don't expect to get there. I don't expect to win. That's my weird rant with 8 different metaphors.
Yeah, I love that you bring up faith. It's a little bit of like, as an anarchist, a little bit of a contentious topic sometimes.
Oh, it's taboo.
Very, and I love talking about it. I wasn't raised Christian, but I do practice Christianity now, which is also just kind of a strange thing in my circles. But recently I was with a group of friends who, all of whom have like anarchist leaning beliefs and who are really spiritual people. And we've gotten together and found a particular space that does a particular kind of worship service that really works for us. It's called Tizé. It's a beautiful like, nighttime candlelight, meditative, lots of like repetitive singing kind of practice. And we got together afterward to have a dinner and talk about all of the things that we like wouldn't otherwise have space to voice, whether that's with our anarchist friends or with people in like other, church communities that we're a part of. And something that I was reflecting on in this space was just like, what do I do about the question of hope and despair, and how, like, especially right now, I mean, I think honestly, before October of last year, I felt still like I was holding on to hope as something that I could practice and something that I could get behind. And since then, I felt more and more of this, like, the despair, the like looking at the world is really exhausting and really just hard and depressing. And I've struggled since then. But I've come back to this question of faith because it's similar to what you're saying about hope. It feels a little bit like, I don't know if delusional is the right word. It feels a little bit like I have to like believe in a time where believing that there's something to like work toward is extremely challenging and maybe a little bit misguided in some ways. But the thing that I was reflecting on with this group of friends, particularly about faith, was just also the ways that I have been able to tap into my own spirituality and my own sense of connection with, the world around me and the divine is having faith in myself. And that is something like having faith in the things that I experience as like worth following and as worth listening to and worth practicing. And a lot of that stuff is things that are like really hard to put into words and really confusing. And, I identify as a mystic, like that stuff can seem really like out there sometimes. But it is deeply what keeps me going in a lot of ways. And it's also, I think, similar to what you're talking about, planting an orchard, like gardening, all this stuff like that has given me so much peace and life and something to look forward to, every winter. I mean, I live in Minnesota. Every winter except this one has been really challenging because it's just many months of like frigid cold and just the world is ice. But I know that the plants are coming back. I know that I'm going to see new growth and new life, and that alone inspires so much, hope for me. And that's something I, for now at least, can really count on. But I think there's something to that practice of holding on. That I'm not saying you have to be religious to find this. I'm not saying you even have to really be like have a regular spiritual practice, but there's something there that is like immaterial and not quite tangible. And that's what's beautiful about it. And we have so much wisdom to pull from the histories that exist in these traditions. And believe it or not, there are a lot of really radical, really like values aligned people in like the Catholic tradition, for example, that we can pull from. And there's there's something to that like long view of time, being able to pull from those histories and see like the ways that people were dealing with the same kind of like repression from empire and, you know, like persecution that in many ways a lot of us are dealing with today. So yeah, I love like being able to look at that stuff more. And personally, my politics and my spiritual practice are deeply intertwined because of this particular element of being able to like pull from what is in like my faith tradition's history and looking forward at like what is worth fighting for, even when the whole world around me is telling me that there's not much left to fight for. And then, yeah, just the other piece about despair that I wanted to bring into the conversation is like accepting this as a natural reaction to the world that we're living in. My therapist is constantly reminding me that like, if you weren't feeling bad about this stuff, that's probably a bigger problem, right? Like it's pretty natural to respond with despair when things are really bad.
Yeah.
And the question then for us becomes like, how do we actually deal with that? Like, do we let it like knock us down, or do we look at it, accept it, and move with it forward somehow?
Or do we get knocked down and then get up again?
Exactly.
They're never going to keep us down.
I would use this as an excuse to quote or at least paraphrase Baldwin, because this podcast is named after one of his books. There is this, he mentions like the hypocrisy of the Christian world, as he called it, because his own religiosity it's always complicated. I would say he was still a believer, so to speak, by the end of his life, but he actually has this paraphrase, because for those who don't know, he was raised very Christian. He was a choir boy. His stepfather, who he would call his father, was like a minister, and so on. And he has like Jesus, something along the lines of Jesus said, you know, feed the poor, whatever it might be. Like that there are these things to do, like clothe the needy, you know, stuff like that. And if you don't do that, you're not a believer, is what he said. And his the argument, if you want, in that is that there's so many people, and he was referring to like, I think especially like in positions of power in institutions, politicians, high-ranking members of religious institutions, whatever, would use a lot of talk, like what Jesus believed in, or at least said we should believe in, whatever, that sort of thing, the Gospels. And I was actually raised Catholic. I was very religious up until a certain point, and then I told myself I was an atheist, and this was when new atheism was a vibe on the internet. I use that as a refuge, and I take it as a lesson of things not to do. And because one thing that like with that quote in mind is there was very much this argument that the new atheists at the time would say like almost like belief in and of itself is irrational. And obviously like the thing that comes with that, the implication there is that they don't have beliefs, that they're only just fact-based humans. They just follow logic. And if it's not logical, they don't believe in it, because it's this whole thing that I don't need to believe in science because science is fact-based, etc., etc. And the problem, obviously, is that, you know, do they still believe in capitalism? Do they still believe in patriarchy? Do they still believe in, you know, X, Y, or Z? And usually, yes, they did. And that's a belief. You know, believe in a nation state is a belief. It's a social construct at the end of the whole imagined community thing. And so that kind of flipped it in some sense in my head. Like, if the definition of religious is having faith, you know, in the sense of like believing in something you don't know for sure it's true or false or whatever, by that definition, they would also fit in that category. Obviously, they have faith in capitalism. They have faith in American supremacy, obviously, and, you know, stuff like that. And so that kind of flipped it. It's like in my head, then it became, well, if they're also the religious one, who are those other people that I suddenly hated because I was a new atheist, you know, and so on. And that kind of, it balanced this. I went to two extremes, let's say. Now it balances themselves out a bit. And now I'm just in the mindset of like, how do I say this? People's individual beliefs are what it is. And in communion and community, also, there are different types of practices that I find very valuable. I personally am very inspired by a lot of like Jewish practices. I don't do them myself, but in some like just friends of mine. And there's something about it that I find very admirable, if that's the correct term, I don't know, or inspiring, that like after hundreds, thousands of years, really, there are still practices that are reproduced, you know, generationally and whatnot. And the people reproducing them, the people participating in them, they themselves may have like 1,000 different reasons for doing so. They could be atheists, they could be like super religious, they could be like agnostic, they could be, whatever, assuming that there are barriers between these categories, which I have doubts about.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So for me, that's where I come from. Let's put it that way. And like in terms of defining oneself as religious or spiritual or whatnot, for me, it's not that it doesn't mean anything. It does.
Mm-hmm.
It's more that I'm actually skeptical of those who say usually that they are just, reasonable people. They're just rational. They, it's the whole like, and it's very gendered usually, obviously, and so on and so forth. I actually question that because I don't buy it. It's really that straightforward. I just don't buy that people who usually say like, you should be realistic. It's the whole Mark Fisher's capitalist realism is what I have in mind here, of like being realistic is actually the term is usually synonymous with just whatever we think the status quo should be, or will be, let's say, and we're not questioning that this is also inherently a form of belief. We're believing in something that we think will happen, regardless of, or should happen maybe, regardless of whether we personally think it shouldn't, or whatever. You see what I mean? Anyway, that was my own. I told you, Aydın, you need to stop me.
Why?
Yeah, no, it's a good. Yeah, I mean, it's like I really appreciate that perspective because it's not something I've really explored too much, and it's making me think actually about this. This in 2017, you wrote this blog post, Margaret, that we republished on Antidote titled "Don't Let Nazis Have Nice Things."
Mm-hmm.
And you talked a lot about how important it is to defend cultural terrain, even and maybe especially in the places where we actually just share common interests and practices. And, it's coming to mind right now, especially with like the way that people kind of react to religion or faith or these kinds of spiritual practices in maybe contemporary times are often associated with the far right, like, Christianity, that's like a thing for the far right. And I'm like, no, they don't get to have that. It's not where it started. Like, and I'm just wondering like how we're doing since 2017 in defending the cultural terrain from fascists, in your opinion, and where are you focusing your efforts right now? What can we be doing more of?
It's funny is I actually feel in some ways I have less like, in my 20s and 30s, I felt like I had like my finger on the pulse of culture in a lot more ways, partly because I traveled full time and I, was constantly meeting new people and seeing how different radical scenes were handling things and things like that. And now I'm much more specialized, which is my nice way of saying I live alone on a mountain with my dog. And, I work on the things that I work on. So in some ways, I'm not sure, but in other ways, there are a lot of things that I've seen. And one of them, I don't think it's a coincidence that as things get very dire, I mean, again, things have been very dire for a lot of people a lot of times, right? And apocalypses happen all the time, But as things get dire on this sort of like global level in a way that is actually penetrating the safety bubble of the Western world, or the privileged people in the Western world, whatever. I don't think it's a coincidence that religious radicalism and or like openly spiritual practices are returning to a space that had been formerly, if it were to be identified religiously, it would have been atheist. The left in general comes out of this very European Marxist materialist thing that I don't have a lot of nice things to say about. And I mean, part of the reason that this is happening is because of, again, I more know about the anarchist tradition and things like that. This broader anarchic understanding that is basically, what if similar conclusions as anarchism, but not coming from Enlightenment European thinking, right? In the United States, it's very influenced by indigenous anarchists. I mean, a lot of indigenous anarchists are atheists, but a lot of them are also like, shut the fuck up about atheism, And one of the things, so I do this history podcast, and the most recent episode that I just finished researching is about the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916. And it was this like wild combination of Irish nationalists who were interested primarily in Irish culture and poetry and things like that, and a socialist movement. And there were a lot of things that differentiated the socialist movement of the Easter Rising, primarily identified with this guy, James Connolly, from the larger Marxist tradition that he was ostensibly part of. And one of them is he kept writing these essays that were basically like, shut the fuck up, atheists. And it wasn't, I mean, he was kind of he was like, look, I'm not saying the church is good. And he like wrote more critical of the church than he did about anything else in a lot of ways, right? But it was like the new atheist thing is 100 years old, you know? It was the like, oh, y'all are dum-dums because you think there's a sky god, you know? And like, and anyone who's like actually explored theological understandings is like, most of us don't think there's a guy on a throne in the sky with a beard who throws lightning bolts or whatever, you know?
I mean, that would be cool, to be honest.
I know, right? Yeah, like I'm not anti, like whatever. Then we have a clear enemy, right?
Right.
But you know, and so he was writing all of this stuff, and he was like reconciling. He was sort of trying to reconcile faith with materialism, but primarily it was a political thing. It was primarily like, we don't need you to come in here. What we need to do is get the Protestants and the Catholics to realize they're on the same side and end colonialism, you know? And at the end of the day, that is what the Easter Rising was. It wasn't later the Catholic Church comes in and is like, oh, we're a theocracy. The Catholics are like the real Irish people, right? You know? And it's really easy for radicals today to fall into believing that, right? But all of the old radicals, not all of them, but most of the old radicals, the ones worth listening to, were all about people getting over their religious differences. Okay, then the other thing I just finished researching was about, you mentioned Paradise Built in Hell and Katrina that happened in New Orleans. And I just finished an episode about Common Ground Collective, which was the collective that I would say spurred American mutual aid in the past 20 years. 19 years, because it was 19 years ago that Common Ground formed, right? I think it has been influenced heavily by that. And one of the things that like people kind of conveniently write that history as if, oh, I don't know, the Black Panthers free food program wasn't started by churches. Or in this case, the first medical clinic that was the Common Ground Collective was started at a mosque because Malik was Muslim and started it at the mosque that he went to. And it was pastors helping, you know, anarchists and Panthers and whatever, like coming together. And it shouldn't be left out of the history because it's one of the coolest things about it. Not that it was religious, but that it wasn't anti-religious, because all of the people who are saying, hey, we can make this happen, even though we're going to fight the largest institution in the world, the American government, on this, right? And we're going to fight the largest economic system that's ever existed, you know, Western capitalism. You have to have a certain amount of faith or hope in order to think that that's worth doing. Again, with the exception of the wild nihilists, full respect to them. But the people who were willing to say that and do that were wild-eyed. And they were wild-eyed coming from one background or another. And there's a lot of different ideological and theological frameworks that provide that to people. And some of them are Muslim, and some of them are Christian, and some of them are Jewish, and some of them are atheistic anarchist, and some of them are atheistic materialist Marxist, and whatever. And it's not like all those things are all necessarily samey, but there's like there's a reason that group was called Common Ground, which was literally this former Black Panther, Robert King, was like, all we need to do is find common ground. I feel like I kind of like sidestepped your question. Okay, how are we doing in terms of cultural terrain? I will say, I think overall people have stepped up and not let them take European paganism. I think overall it has proliferated that people are like Odin is the All-Father, not the Sun-Father, and get your hands off those runes and stuff like that. I think overall that has started to happen. I'm interested to see how that will and won't happen with other religious space. And right now, again, and I'm very sorry to the listeners who were like, oh, another American lady is just fucking talking about America. But like, this is what I know the most about. One of the things that's happening here is that all of these far-right evangelical Protestant white nationalists have all decided that they're Catholic because Catholicism offers the most like rules and like bootlicking. And then they show up and then they're like, wait, Catholicism is like anti-racist as hell. Okay, Catholicism has a lot of problems. Again, I'm not trying to like become like a specific apologist or whatever, right? But like it is a very multiracial faith, and it has very specific teachings around like taking care of people and not being a fucking racist. And so you're running all these Catholics, these new Catholics, these white Christian nationalists who are like, what do you mean the Pope says that we're not supposed to hate gay people, even though Catholicism has a very complicated history of LGBT rights? But it's like fundamentally based not in like hatred of gay people. It's like a condescending, we love you, but you can't do that or whatever, right? But they want to come in with hate, and then it's like not working. And then they're like, well, what the fuck? And you can read all of these like threads from all of these fucking Nazis who are like, why isn't the Catholic faith working? Like, well, for one thing, the Catholics voted against Hitler, and then anyway, whatever. Okay, sorry. This is like, I researched this shit way too much. And I think that there is maybe starting to be a turn, maybe starting to be a turning point where we are now able to like, white Christian nationalism probably is not at its peak. It will probably continue to grow, and it will continue to make the majority of Christians look bad and be real sad. And or majority of Christians will join them or whatever. I don't fucking know, you know? But I think we're starting to see. Okay, one more weird thing that I think about too much. I love winter solstice. I love winter solstice. It's my favorite time of year. I have a weird thing where I love winter. Actually, to go with this whole thing, actually, the mourning that I feel, the grief that I feel, every time it snows, I'm like, is this the last time I'm going to have fucking snow? You know, I'm so grateful for snow. I live in the mountains, but I don't live in the north, and you know, whatever. Anyway, so I love winter solstice. Winter solstice is not the coldest time of the year. It's the darkest time of year. And it is when the light returns. And the light returns as the cold sets in. And that is the pattern that I think about the most. And people are always like, oh, it's darkest before the sun rises. Like, that's not fucking true. That's a stupid, whoever, like, that's the worst quote. Because it misses what's right there, which is that it is coldest when the sun rises. And the sun starting to return, like, does not make the world warmer. It puts in place the thing that will eventually make the world warmer, you know? And so when we're at the turning point, it means everything's about to get worse. And that's something that I hold on to for hope. I hold on to for hope is that, like, maybe we're at this turning point, which doesn't mean that shit isn't about to get real fucking hard. Okay, that's my rant.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
As I said, these things, we prepared questions and we ignored most of them. Okay. As I say, I grew up in Lebanon, and I'm from a pretty religious background. Most of my family are very religious, like the monks in the family and shit like that. And one thing that I always tell folks, because I only recently realized how unusual, at least bizarre of a story it is that I genuinely did not know up until the age of, I'm gonna say 16 or 17, that the word Allah is the same word used by Muslims. I genuinely did not know that. Because
you just knew it as the word for God.
That's it. Like, it's like when you say our Father who art in heaven, we do the same thing, and then at some point there's Allah in there, and there's no like, it's just the word. There's no like different word for God, but not that God. It's just God.
Yeah.
And the thing that was very topsy-turvy for me I'm reading now Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, so I have a lot of the mirror world imagery in my head. And for me, one of the most bizarre thing I've ever experienced, and it's just gotten weirder since, is like white Americans, especially evangelicals, usually, not always, talking about Jesus as a white guy, like just like that. And and for me, it's more like, I grew up in an environment like he's like 5 minutes away from, it's like
yeah, totally.
It's like, oh, well, my church is older, and no, he could be a cousin, shit like it's genuine. It's a joke in many ways, but it's also something that I was feeling that I need to defend Christianity from Christians, because I just had this different perception in my head. Like, the Levant is small compared to most of the rest of the world. The distance between like where I grew up and what's now like Israel, Palestine is short. It's very short. You can miss it on the map. Well, now it's very long because there are borders, but historically it was very short. And in my head, it was just one of those things I took for granted until it was like violently it felt anyway like it was a clash, that was a very violent clash, like 9/11 and then the war in Iraq and then all of that, and framed very, very specifically by Bush and others, obviously at the time, like in crusader terms. And then I remember being obsessed by the Crusades and understanding, like, you mean those people over there came here to it's all of that. And I was very, very disoriented for a very long time, because I genuinely thought for what felt like the longest time, at least the period of my life where I was very religious, that the center of Christianity, which I'm not saying would not be problematic, but that's how like different it was actually here. Right. We, like, where I was living was the center of Christianity historically, or whatever. And right. The contrast was very, and the word I'm using is violent, but the only reason I'm bringing all of that is that it kind of brings me back to what I mentioned before, like, of like, what is even belief? Like, if they're saying, and sometimes in those terms, like, Jesus was basically a white guy, or even if they don't say so, the imagery is there, and that's basically the default, the normalized, the hegemonic, whatever we want to use, portrayal of Jesus. I remember in Lebanon, there are lots of like Ethiopians who come as migrant domestic workers, and many of them would have like pictures of Jesus, and Jesus is a black guy. And that for me felt as normal, quote unquote, as the Jesus that were in our houses and so on. And then when I saw the very white one, I was just confused. Who is this? I was like, it just sounded weird, because I know what people from my region look like because I'm from like these, from my people, I'm just confused by this different interpretation of things, let's say. And that's what kind of brought home to me this notion that, what again, realism in the quotation, like capitalist realism, as in, you don't know that you have a belief, but you're acting as if it's the status quo, as if this is just normal, this is just the air we breathe, but actually it's a social construct. And that for me is what kind of put these things in perspective. And it's why, like, you mentioned like hope is a discipline. For me, it's also like it's a verb. Like David Graeber would say, like, anarchism is a verb to him. Yeah. And for me, it's a bit that. It's just it's something to do. It's something to maybe sometimes I feel like I have it. But honestly, a lot of the times I'm doing podcasts, let's say. I've been doing this for 4 years now, soon. Started with the pandemic. And so we have that in common. And I would have conversations with other folks who are in a different mindset than what I would currently be in, if that makes sense. Like they would be talking about hope, let's say, or they would be talking about solar punk, something I do a lot, or climate fiction, or that sort of thing. And I would be talking as if I was currently feeling it, if that makes sense. Because I sort of, I think, realized at some point, there's not that I'm lying to myself if I'm feeling particularly depressed that day, but I'm talking about something that's very hopeful. I don't see this as like lying to myself. I actually see this as part of the practice of dealing with that depression.
Yeah, totally.
And, yeah.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah.
No, you were just agreeing. And the last thing, there was a quote that was used in a Lausanne piece that I contributed to, of like, hope isn't something that, or rather, revolution isn't something that you replace revolution with hope, however this makes sense, but isn't something that you that just dies out. It actually picks off. I'm very bad with quotes. The jack just picks off steam elsewhere. Like, you're just picking it up from where someone else left it, basically.
Totally.
And that's labor. Like, that's a work. That's something that had to be done for a number of years. And that, just as like with shifting baseline syndrome, where now as we think a lot of the negatives, for those who don't know, sorry, quickly, usually the example that's given to explain shifting baseline syndrome is like, let's say 3 generations ago, a fisherman, human, whatever, with fish, like 100 tons of fish, I don't know, whatever. And then that's the normal. And then let's say their kid starts fishing 50 tons of fish, and that's the new normal. And so they forget in many ways that the previous normal was 100. And so then you complete that logic in some sense. And then we don't think about the dodo, we don't think about the mammoth, and so on. And at some point down the line, unfortunately, it's very depressing to say, but we may very well get to a world where the very notion of a polar bear is just not a thing that a generation knows anymore. It becomes like the way we think about the dodo.
Yeah.
And that's a very hard thing to hold. But the reverse is also true. We take for granted the progresses that were made, for the most part. We take for granted that, like, today we live in a world where you can have like trad Catholic women, especially in the US, who talk about how they want to be housewives and whatnot, which is whatever, do your thing. But they do so in the language of choice, which is a language that could only have been possible through the work and labor of feminists and others. And so they take advantage of that in many ways. They don't recognize it, of course, or Meloni in Italy is the best example, God, family, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
If you follow that logic through, you should not be in that position. But it doesn't matter, because as we say with beliefs, it's pretty flexible, and whether they are hypocrite or not about it, it's up to them to figure it out. But what I'm trying to say is, I don't think this is the framework that ends it all. I think in many ways we're all hypocrites. It's okay. I mean, not okay, but it's gonna happen, and it's just more important to recognize it and maybe do something about it than pretend, to play this purity politics of who's better than the other and whatnot, because it feels like more of a, like it usually goes downhill pretty quickly when we start playing that game, in my opinion. But I talked a lot again.
No, okay, wait.
Thank goodness this is a podcast. Yeah, go for it.
You mean people are sinning? Only they're using the word sin to mean like this horrible thing that can never be erased from your soul. Whereas, again, at least in the Catholic faith, you just deal with it. It just happens all the time. It's not a big deal.
Mm-hmm. These
are these moments where I'm like, sometimes these things that people like, we decide we have to just create everything from scratch, and forget all of this work that's happened for thousands of years. And so then we just recreate all of these horrible problems, and we're like, oh yeah, we've created this pure, this is kind of a tangential thing, this problem with how we talk about like how everyone needs to be like pure, there's the left will kick you out for one sin, the right will accept you for one virtue, which is which I think actually the really clever anti-fascists do the work of like infiltrating the right and then being like, oh, that guy is not pure, and then get them to fight in that same way. But that's some black magic in kind of a literal way. I don't know where I'm going with that.
No, I mean, as I said, these things can go into very, very different directions. Aydın, do you wanna save my brain here?
Yeah, well, it's I mean the quote that you were trying to pull out, Joey. I remember that article.
Yeah, for Lausanne,
you wrote that, right? It was.
I'll find it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember like the sort of the sentiment that you're getting at of like, in one place, people are like, at any given moment, there are uprisings and attempts at revolution happening everywhere, right? And that's something that's really, as people who are very steeped in that work, it can be kind of hard to remember to like look at the bigger picture of how amazing that is, and to not just like get stuck in that, well, okay, like, yes, we're doing some really cool stuff, but like, we're not there yet, or like, we haven't fully toppled the regime, or like these forces, these like zombie capitalist forces are still holding on. And still like, I still have to like go work my job after we're done with this interview. And like, that's, I don't get to I'm not like fully there. We're not fully there, but the amazing thing about getting to step back and look at that bigger picture is that we are like continuing that momentum even as things get like worse and worse. And I mean, I think this ties really well in with what you were saying earlier, Margaret, about the light and the cold, like the light kind of coming back as in the coldest moment, or in the coldest, or like as the cold sets in. And that there's a contradiction there. And I think there's a lot of contradictions in the things that we're talking about, and in the framework that you use in that essay, and like just broadly as people who are trying to bring about the like quote unquote new world in the shell of the old, that like all of these contradictions can be really difficult to hold, especially when we're dealing with like so much anxiety about like just the immediate worries of like, what am I going to be able to like count on tomorrow? That's super real. And how do I think about like long-term work and finding joy when tomorrow feels really uncertain, when these like immediate needs feel really uncertain, and there's like the privilege of being able to like know that I'll eat later. Like, does that mean that I can't also feel despair? Like, no, I don't know. I think that's the beauty of like feeling connected to one another and like around the world and to like different social movements, even if we don't completely agree with everything that other folks in other places or even in our own communities believe in, is that like we're a part of this broader, bigger movement toward things changing and like being radically different in the midst of like everything falling apart. So yeah, I really appreciate the conversation of like being able to remember that bigger picture and have faith in it, so to speak.
No, yeah, I remember the first time I really started caring about history was after I became an anarchist, because when I was a kid and I was reading, being taught American history by some people who were vaguely good at it and some people were very, very bad at it. And, I didn't see myself in it. There was not a place. I mean, obviously I was like a fucking white kid in America, like, and, saw my demographic represented all over the place, especially because I didn't know I was trans yet. But whatever, I didn't care. I did not care about history. And then I became an anarchist. And then I started being like, I am part of this tradition. And I started to realize that, like, regardless of where people are born or what struggle or when, we're all connected in this fight against authoritarianism and capitalism and all the isms and all that shit, And then I started being like, oh, like, here's me in Patagonia, and here's me in Siberia, and me is not literal in this case, but like, here's several Japanese women who tried to kill emperors and shit because they believed the same things that I believe, and that learning an ideological tradition started opening things up. And then things opened up even more when I started realizing that I have an interest in a blurry and permeable barrier around my anarchism, or the thing that I care about. And so then I can start seeing like these broader struggles that like may or may not have ideologically identified the same as I do. Obviously there's certain, and I'm like, I don't see myself in the fucking Bolsheviks, but I see myself in the people who were like not sure and then like went back and forth, and then, and I see myself in a lot of like people who specifically identified with things that I would probably be in conflict with right now, And that, yeah, it starts opening things up. And then what's been really interesting is then to open that up beyond the past 200 years that people have called themselves anarchists or whatever, and just see the same patterns and be like, oh, I am part of these patterns. I am part of the great fabric of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right, for sure. Yeah, that brings to mind this. There's a chapter in this book that Cindy Milstein, it's called Rebellious Morning. And it's a chapter about talking about organizing in Japan after 2011 in Fukushima, the nuclear reactor situation. And they're talking about how like there's all of these anarchists that are like kind of making a mess trying to organize, and like they aren't super coherent. They're not like figuring out really how to bring things together. And then they sort of talk about the moms and the grandmas who are organizing in their communities to like test the water for radiation and that kind of stuff. And I just remember this moment of reading this, like, oh, these are the people who are doing the like true anarchist practice, and they're not calling themselves anarchists. And that was like such an eye-opening moment for me in my own political development of like, okay, yeah, we can also look at like the bigger picture. Like, you don't have to believe in these things or hold on to them as an ideology. It's more about how you act in the world and treat one another. And I just like feeling like, I mean, it's, yeah, of course, like naturally the place to start is like, who do we have these beliefs in common with? And then looking at the broader arc of history of like, have been people everywhere all the time who are just fighting to like take care of their communities and like, love one another better.
And we don't have to claim them to celebrate them. We don't have to be like, oh, this is the real anarchist. Like it gets actually, you start running into the, was Jesus a communist, or was Jesus an anarchist, or was Jesus a blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, Jesus is a dead Palestinian man who did what made sense to him in the context he was living in. He was not an anti-capitalist because there literally wasn't capitalism. He was opposed to the economic systems that were happening and worked against them in ways that made sense that don't translate to today, right? Because we live in a different world. So he did what made sense to him in the conditions he was in, and we don't have to claim him. Like, we don't have to, Jesus wasn't anything. He's a dead guy who was interesting. You know,
For sure.
that was my attempt to tie it off all back
That was
in.
great. No, I love it.
Jesus was a dead guy who was interesting.
Yeah, that's my least offensive to everyone version of it.
Love it.
Okay, we do have to wrap up because time is still linear, or some very smart joke along those lines. So, okay, this is actually fun. I was going to ask you to talk about Penumbra City, and I was just checking the Patreon, and it just says Penumbra City is here, like just now, which is amazing,
today.
amazing timing.
Yesterday and today.
Like while you were chatting.
Yeah.
So, let's talk about it a bit because I like it's also something like people can do, which is fun. I would get a copy at some point. And then after that, also to wrap up, Aydın, if you wanna, closing thoughts or talk about Antidote. So yeah, Margaret, tell us about Penumbra City.
Yeah, I am a co-writer on a tabletop role-playing game called Penumbra City that, you can get together with your friends in real life or on Zoom and play this hopefully fun game, where you make characters and run around, pretend to be them and roll 20-sided dice and all that stuff. And it came out today as of recording. We kickstarted it last summer. I'm really grateful and kind of humbled by people's interest in it. And it is set in an alternate 19th century, early 20th century world ruled by god kings. And you play in a decadent, collapsing city that has kind of Weimar Germany sort of vibes, as various different gangs fight for power, and you can eat mushrooms and talk to rats, or summon demons from other worlds, or ride a horse with a sword cane, or run around with a sword and plate armor screaming about anarchism from a 2,000-year-old tradition. There's lots of stuff you can do in the game. And it came out from Strangers in the Tangled Wilderness, which is the publishing collective that I work with, and you can get it there. We try to make the PDF affordable. The book itself is like hardcover and embossed, and role-playing game books are expensive, and we're not sorry. But we try to make up for that by making the digital versions and stuff as affordable as possible. That is the thing that... and actually how this all ties in to what we were talking about before is that I first started writing this world as a novel more than 10 years ago in Mainz, Germany, staying at a Wagenplatz. And I was like just bored and didn't have a computer. So I started like filling notebooks with this weird world. And then this role-playing game maker was like, hey, we want to like hire you to write a game world. And I was like, great, I got one. And then I wrote like 50,000 words, like almost a novel's worth of words about this game world. And then the publisher just disappeared, just had like a different Kickstarter that succeeded, but then he didn't successfully make the game. So he sort of disappeared. So I was like sitting around with this orphan work, I wrote this whole game world, and it was kind of this, I've been kind of on this page for the past several years where I'm like, I'm not usually starting new projects now. I'm tying up all the ends. I'm doing the Swedish death cleanse, but for my projects in life, because I could die tomorrow, and I hope I don't. I hope I live another 60 years. And then I found an amazing team of people, including, I'm not a game mechanics writer really at heart. I've done a little bit of it, but my friend and co-writer Inman has been working on it. And then Robin Savage is the illustrator, and Cassandra is doing all the design, and just got a really amazing team of people together to put this game out that you can play.
Awesome. So listeners, do that. Aydın, you want the final word? Or because if I start talking, no one can stop me.
Well, yeah, I'm super grateful for this conversation. It's been very fun. I'm sure we could go for a very long time. So as I mentioned earlier, I collaborate on this website called antidotezine.com. Check it out. There's a lot. There's something for everyone on there. And
except for Nazis.
If you are ever interested, they can check it out too. They probably won't like what they find. But it's there's not something for them. Maybe there's something to like help them out of it. But if you are ever interested in helping us transcribe, particularly podcasts from the Fire These Times, we have a whole page dedicated to those transcriptions. We post polished versions of them on Antidote, and we also post transcripts. We're working on posting transcripts to the Fire These Times website as well. If that's something that you like to do, you can reach out to us at antidote@riseup.net. and collaborate with us on making these lovely podcasts more accessible in written format. It's been a real pleasure to be with you both. And thank you for having me on too.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was really fun. All of the thingies will be mentioned in the thingy below the
Stuff.
description. Yeah, the show notes. Show notes is the word. Sorry, I'm tired. Okay, thanks a lot, Margaret. Thanks, Aydın.
Thanks for having me.
This has been another episode of the Fire These Times. If you like this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. And if you really like this podcast, head on to patreon.com/firethesetimes. That's patreon.com/firethesetimes. The Fire These Times is a media ecosystem based in the Periphery that supports a bunch of media projects including this one. For $5 a month, and even less if you opt for the yearly subscription, you can help this ecosystem grow and get early access to all episodes of the Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, Obscuristan, and Ghida, as well as an invitation to join our monthly hangout, watch parties, upcoming book club, as well as exclusive episodes. Thank you for listening, and take care everyone.